Bitter coffee. Commercial trade and economics are manifestations of something inherent in human nature or of life in society. We make, produce, and transform, and have been doing so since the beginning of time. The history of commerce sheds light on a substantial part of human history, providing special insight on our evolution as a species. Commerce is so tightly woven into the destiny of peoples that through its development, as through a mirror, we can see the birth, rise, and fall of civilizations.
And don't worry, it'll only get worse. And what does this mean? Well, if we are not able to stop it, and that's why we're here, to stop it, the data tells us that things are getting worse every day. That 10 million hectares of forest disappear every year. That deserts are growing some 6 million hectares a year. That 10 multinationals control not only the land, the water and seeds, but also toxic residues, agrochemistry and the food processing industry. Or that one multinational like Monsanto controls everyone here. In the 80s, the difference wasn't 30 to 1, but 60 to 1. In the 90s, the difference wasn't 60 to 1, but 80 to 1. And presently, the data tells us that the difference is 95 to 1. What am I thinking of? Of speculation, of the concentration of capital, of dislocation, of the disappearance of regulatory standards. In any case, the differences are great, and they are increasing every day. So in the second part of this diagnosis, I will try to explain the reasons behind this change, why some are getting richer and richer, why others are getting poorer and poorer, and what mechanisms are behind enrichment and impoverishment.
If we go back in time, we must go as far back as the ancient times of Homer and Solomon to see the first important commercial relations. Those exchanges over the seas were a beacon of light for knowledge and the prosperity of that era. Aristotle said that the economy was the honest and prudent administration of goods. But a few eras later, this precept seems to have been turned on its head. The current trend of economic globalization, of international commerce and its devastating mechanism are wreaking havoc in poor countries, in the biosphere, and is threatening the survival of the planet. How have we arrived at this point? Why did this happen? Are we witnessing the extinction of an economic model, of a way of life?
And it's true. If we take into consideration the evolution of global trade, we will see that international commerce grows daily. It's one of the great symbols of globalization, but also that the terms of this trade are more and more damaging to third world countries.
Well, in terms of the concentration of business on a global scale, it's one of the most dramatic trends of the last decade. It's true that it's a logical mechanism of capitalism, as competition tends to lead to mergers, for companies to become bigger and bigger. But in the last decade, we've gone from a situation of corporate mergers, which in 1991 represented some $475 billion of activity, and some 10 years later, this activity represented some $3.5 billion.
I was surprised because about 3 years ago, the United Nations, which usually speaks, let's say, diplomatically, published a report in which their famous diplomacy was absent, because they accused 32 companies in the world of decimating the natural resources of the Congo, thanks to an agreement which lasted for 30 years and was made with the then president, who I'm sure you will all remember was a corrupt man called Mobutu.
The sale of seeds, compared to that of processed foods, drinks, and so forth, is much smaller. But why is it so important? Because they are keys that open, that start the chain. Whoever has control of seeds will have control of the entire food chain, so Monsanto is the company controlling seeds now. It's the one with the highest percentage of control, together with others who aren't exactly angelic.
And the company who was #1 on the list of those companies which strips the Congo of its wealth is called Bayer. It makes aspirin and sometimes helps us with headaches. What we fear is that these big exporters, who are big multinationals and who have nothing in common with these less developed countries, are basing their strategy on receiving preferential treatment and taking advantage of miserable work conditions and miserable salaries to manufacture in these countries, to flood our markets, and to lead our farmers to ruin.
We could achieve and implement agrarian reform in order to stop the transnational companies. And it wouldn't be a problem because what are they doing now? In order to destroy the little land that's left in the hands of small-scale farmers, nowadays they are creating new production systems, new markets for their goods, of monoculture mainly for exporting, and what they are doing is annihilating the land in order to produce food. Traveling to Ejido in Almeria, Spain, is also like traveling to another time. To a depressing futuristic landscape, a sea of plastic. It is obvious that the development model of the 1960s has reached bottom and has seriously assaulted the environment.
A young person that starts out farming can't make it. He's got to buy a house and from there buy a truck because he needs it for work, and from there build greenhouses. He can't do it. Right now, he can't do it. When we started back then, one dreamed up the idea. The other moved ahead, and we made it that way. My money's in these greenhouses. I'm paying them off. But the kind of money we used to make from this then, no way.
Sadly, many of the crops will be left to rot in the greenhouses because the prices that middlemen offer the farmers often do not cover the cost of harvesting them.
Red peppers at €3. See? Now that's work. €3 over there. And here they pay 20 cents, 10 cents, all the peppers you want.
The price paid to the farmer for a kilo of ripe red peppers is multiplied by 200 to 300 by the time it reaches the consumer. The same happens with other crops. Coffee becomes the bitter fruit of underdevelopment for the producing farmers. This year, in the citrus groves of Valencia, thousands of tons of oranges have rotted on the trees. Who determines prices? How many jobs are destroyed? Who benefits from this enormous inequality?
Also, the system of creating prices that exists in the market today, in the European market and the international market, follows a pattern which is the opposite of what is logical. A company implements a strategy and sets a price in the market in order to enter that market without considering what it should pay the producer. That comes later. It sets its objective and from there backtracks, concentrating more and more pressure as we get close to the producer. But it doesn't care. For this company, what's important is to be the first and the most competitive in the market. Last year, a report was issued outlining the deterioration of the price structure of coffee, one of the more representative products of the Third World. And it stated that if 10 years ago, from Colombia to Nicaragua, a ton of coffee went for 3,000 pesos or whatever currency, now a ton of coffee sells for 1,000. Which means that Colombians, for a ton of coffee, used to be able to buy 3 sewing machines, for example. Whereas now, for a ton of coffee, they can only get 1 sewing machine, because they're only being paid a third of what they used to be paid. We also think that the food industry should belong to those who work in it. That collectively owned and solidarity-based food distribution channels should be created. The hard part isn't producing, but selling. And there's a lovely curve which describes how the income of Costa Rica and Colombia decreases. while the income of the corresponding middlemen are increasing. This is described in great detail, and I won't get into details here, but the main culprit behind this situation is called Nestle. I'm telling you this so that you'll know what to expect from giant companies like this. Nobody is the owner of wage labor, not in the north and not in the south. I think that if there's one word to summarize contemporary economic relations, it's that magic word, competitiveness. Anybody with half a brain knows that the last 15 years have involved competitive gains, which for us has meant lower and lower salaries, longer and longer work weeks, backpedaling in the field of social gains, job insecurity everywhere. We also think that there should be a bank, a public bank, to finance this agrarian reform, and everything that it involves, and development, not only of agriculture, industry and the environment, but also of hospitals, schools, housing and so on. But I'd like to point out that this is a global project. The success of the competitiveness project derives from the fact that the sales pitch is based on the same principles everywhere. What are we hearing in the European Union? We are told we have to tighten our belts. If not, the United States, Japan and China are going to win the competitiveness battle. And that's being said in the United States too. You've got to tighten your belts, otherwise the European Union, Japan and China are going to win the competitiveness battle. And in Japan, they're saying that belt tightening is in order. Otherwise, the United States, the European Union and China will win the battle for competitiveness. In China, they're not saying that, probably because it's impossible to tighten belts any more than they already are. But the letter and the spirit of the message is most probably the same, and you have to admit that it's an ingenious project.
You go alone, quietly, no trying to grab the best before the person next to you does. All the products that you can find in a supermarket go through many hands, and you don't know where they come from. What you do know is how long it's been frozen. So when you arrive at home, you eat something without much of an appetite for it. And eating should be a pleasure. These days we don't have the time to go to the villages, the universities. When we have the farmers' markets, people come. And we are telling people, we are telling our colleagues, enough. Even if it's just with baskets, let's set up shop again with baskets in the squares, on the roadsides. And people are grateful. They show their gratitude by buying from you. And the relationship is re-established. It shouldn't be broken. Our communication has to remain oral.
Therefore, we believe that there shouldn't be price differences. We've had a lot of experiences in local markets, which are fundamentally based in terms of who offers the product at the same price as the conventional price. And the prices established by the organizations of producers, together with the consumers, are a reflection of the prices of the conventional products.
Since Phoenician times, politics and economics have been two sides of the same coin. Political economy was defined as a science by the Greeks. No war was ever started without an economic factor at its deepest roots. Are we really being protected by states?
The agricultural policy of the European Union, with all its faults, is a policy of social and territorial cohesion. And therefore we need a common agricultural policy for our agricultural model, which, I insist, should be based on the family farm to survive. So our industry was developed thanks to protectionism. And now we have an institution that I mentioned a little while ago, which is called the World Trade Organization, and which is preaching development based on the opposite, which is free trade. But with free trade, nobody has ever developed. Nobody. So we are here to oppose with all our efforts, and especially with all of our arguments, this situation where the only beneficiaries are going to be the big multinational companies, which, I insist, are going to produce in the least developed countries. Their agricultural production will flood our markets, which, unfortunately, are the only ones that can afford agricultural products. And these multinational companies will not contribute at all to the economic and the social development of these developing countries. We have consolidated an area of alliances. The world is not for sale. We've consolidated a series of messages. It's not only Via Campesina which is calling for the World Trade Organization to stay out of agriculture. Trade unions are asking for the World Trade Organization to stay out of education, to stay out of health, out of the seas, and other campaigns such as the World Trade Organization to stay out of natural resources. So the First World was developed on the basis of protectionism. And now that we are developed, we are imposing free trade on the Third World, and we are preventing them from developing. A lot has been done, and we've achieved a lot. But there are also signs that within these social movements, these citizen movements, we've forgotten the role of the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. How many members are there in the International Monetary Fund? 170 member countries. How many are rich? 40. How many are poor? 130. One would expect that from an organization which is mainly composed of poor countries, we wouldn't be getting piddly 4% reductions of debt, like I mentioned before, but some massive debt cancellation decisions. Why isn't this happening? Why doesn't the International Monetary Fund take this decision? Simply because the International Monetary Fund has a perverse decision-making structure. I think that the essence of the debt problem is a very startling issue, which is that poor countries are financing the economies of rich countries. And we should push this argument in its most literal form. This is no metaphor. In the end, the amount of resources that must be paid back are so much higher than what was originally received, that our countries are now enriching themselves not only from the daily exploitation of those who live in the Third World, but from the loans given in the past to governments of many countries. External debt is a disaster because it obliges them, as we've said before, to send us many more resources than foreign aid can currently match. But the strange thing is that this debt, which they are paying back, we have been paid for it in large part up front, because thanks to someone like Mobutu, the money for the minerals from the Congo that we've sold is now sitting in accounts in France. But then the Congo is in debt, and they are paying France for this debt. And you will know that the catalogue of crooked presidents produced in the Third World is very thick. A debt that we know from hindsight has mostly benefited the ruling elites of those countries in the South and has not provided any benefits for the average citizens there. This places us in a scenario of such immoral magnitudes that it's hard not to sympathize with the most radical options. And as the logical consequence, we are extremely suspicious of the proposals put forth by the powerful of this world.
As an alternative to unfair and abusive commerce, the fair trade movement was born some 40 years ago. The concept is understood as a trade system based on dialogue, transparency, and respect, which seeks a more equitable form of international trade. It contributes to sustainable development and aims to ensure the rights of producers and workers, especially in the South.
Sometimes we stop in the shop to buy some fair trade sponsored coffee to ease our conscience. But if our conscience still produces discomfort, we buy a second packet of fair trade coffee. And then, if we are still bothered by Christmas time, which is the time when we usually cleanse our conscience, we buy 3 packets of fair trade coffee. We participate in the campaigns of the NGOs, and we leave our conscience completely clean, and we plunge into Christmas consumerism, feeling good.
Fair trade, as it is organized today, and even developed institutionally, is very selective about production. And it's a very harsh selection process. And so it's not only selective about production, but also about those people who can participate in production. And it ends up being an inclusive commerce, right? But but also based on intermediaries. We buy from producers from countries of the South under fair trade conditions. And the rules of fair trade under which we operate include cooperatives where women have the same work conditions as men, where the environment is not damaged in the production process of the goods we carry, that they don't involve child labor, they have democratic decision-taking processes, and all the products we sell here meet this criteria. The middleman involved is very close to us, a good friend of ours, or at least he speaks that way, but he follows the same old trade rules. So that's why we say this fair trade, which creates hopes and expectations, ends up being unfair trade. Very often we pre-finance them. That is, we pay up front, so they don't have to wait for us to sell their products, but they get the money on delivery. And in exchange, we often give them technical support, especially if they are very small cooperatives. That's the case with many African cooperatives, which are often located in areas with little access to mainstream commerce. And from here they can get ideas for packaging design, while maintaining the culture and the appearance of the products they offer, but giving ideas to help them sell here.
But in any case, it's obvious that during the rest of the year, you're not going to step foot in a fair trade shop. Therefore, the conclusion is very clear. We buy from unfair trade. Otherwise, the rest wouldn't be fair trade.
Attending a conference held by Professor Arcadi Olivares is also a journey to the heart of our conscience. Listening to him opens windows of hope. We often confuse blind consumption with well-being. The famous sentence, "I'm feeling down, I'm going shopping." We should be capable of replacing it with, "I'm feeling down, I'm going to be caring and fair." We can all contribute to sustaining the planet through responsible consumption and social activism to avoid ever-growing abuses and inequalities.
The consumption of those of us who live in the privileged north of the planet is excessive. In 2002 in Johannesburg, the World Conference on the Environment was held, and there we were told that if the world population of over 6,000 million people all wanted to consume the same paper, the same wood, the same petrol, or the same amount of water that the wealthy of this planet are consuming, according to statistics, each American consumes 550 liters of water a day, and each Mozambican consumes 10 liters of water a day. So, as I was saying, if everybody wanted to consume the same as we are, water, wood, and petrol, they said in Johannesburg that in order to meet this new demand, we would need 3 planet Earths. I think that this is the fundamental problem in the discourse of the alternative movements. How we can break this vicious circle, how we can convince the people that we can live with a lot less, and that maybe we'll be a lot happier with a lot less.
Tell people that they shouldn't allow our disappearance, because when we are eliminated, an entire heritage belonging to each country, to each community, to each nation disappears. It's not only the heritage of farmers, it's our job to produce for them. But this is something that belongs to everybody, so all of us have to look after it and defend it. Brazil is the country of Latin America with the greatest social inequalities. The differences between rich and poor are abysmal. In Porto Alegre, Luis Vicente Facco, International Relations Advisor for CONTAG, accompanies us on an unexpected yet memorable journey, a kind of trip through utopia.
And today Simone works on her land, mainly on the production of milk from pasture cows, and she's a reference for what's happening in this area.
My life improved considerably because I used to work in a factory. For 7 years I worked in factories, and I was always getting ill, and I practically lived at the doctor's office. But when I came to live here in this house, we were given this land and we started our business, and I haven't become ill since, and I haven't been to the doctors either. My life changed completely. When I got here, I didn't know anything. I knew that cows produced milk, and that was about it. I know it's funny, but that's my story.
And there's a lot of discrimination against farmers. They're seen as backward people, underdeveloped people, the cabofitos, the cockroaches of life. But not over here, because there's a perfect integration of the urban and the rural.
Nueva Petrópolis, in the heart of the Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, is where the Pia Cooperative and its trade union energize the economic, social, and cultural life of the entire community.
The cooperative resisted buying the Tetra Pak carton for 2 years because we wanted to use bottles and jars. But the market of city consumers kept asking for long-lasting milk, for the convenience of it, and also because Tetra Pak was making propaganda campaigns in the media.
In the Gaucho language, Pia means happy, healthy, beautiful. And this is how the people of this community are. An economy based on solidarity and food sovereignty has generated wealth and prosperity for everyone here.
And this was the work that the Federation did here, and it was a big success, because we changed family farming, and at least nobody's hungry here. They've got enough to eat. On their farms, they've got everything. They've got to have everything. Chickens, pigs, cows, milk, eggs, fruit, vegetables.
They are a dazzling example of how a better world is possible, of how utopia can be made real. As the visionary economist Agustí Chalot de Subirá once said, in economic terms, love is the means of production which generates the most added value. A moving and profoundly scientific thought indeed.